last time, really for the last couple of days, I have been setting up an alternative narrative, an alternative way to understand it all, understand the cosmos from the beginning until this present day, suggesting a way to understand this strange tension that we may feel between, on the one hand, a universe that seems to have been drained of its meaning, but yet is described extremely well by the laws of physics. And on the other hand, our intuition that something is missing, that the meanings that we find to be embedded within things, that the life that is bursting within everything, and the progress that we see throughout history that seems to be directed towards something, that seems to be directed towards increasing consciousness in some way, so that somehow that's not accounted for in our current purely physical model of the universe. And of course, this physical model of the universe doesn't assert the impossibility of life, how could it? Instead, it makes a really big black box, and it says, it's a big enough universe, there's enough time, there's enough matter doing its thing, mixing and remixing, that it's possible for us to accidentally stumble upon what we have here on this earth, in all its splendor and beauty and so forth. The best that the scientific picture can do is say it's an accident. What I introduced yesterday, on the basis of a few passages in the Baha'i writings, and I think most of us had a chance to read these passages in one of the groups yesterday, is a way to weave together these two stories, the story of integration and disintegration, the story of life and death, of entropy and progress, that suggests that instead of it really being a one-sided arc of the universe somehow starting in a very low entropy state, and now it's just going to keep running down into the far future until the heat death of the universe, that this arc of descent, this arc of creation and then things gradually dying out, is in fact complemented by another no less crucial arc, which is the arc of return. And this circle of existence, this image that is left in our minds, is an image of something that's constantly in dynamic motion, something that is alive, spinning, as it were. One can think of it as an embodiment of, if we use theological language, of God's wanting to be known, bringing the creation into being so that he can be known. Of course, every word of that is fraught with all kinds of anthropomorphic assumptions. So this description of the arc of descent and ascent, the circle of existence, up until now, we've described it, as it were, from the outside. As though we could stand outside the whole thing and say, here's the framework. It's life and death nicely woven together in this dance. What I want to do today is try to catch a glimpse of what it looks like on the inside. That is, if we, all of us humans, actually being on this, along this arc, and situated on this circle of existence, how does one describe from the inside the traversing of the stages back towards union with the One? And I have a few thoughts on this that are drawn from a number of frameworks, we could say, that are given in the Baha'i writings. Because there isn't just a single framework. one of the things that Baha'u'llah says, I think this might have been Abdu'l-Baha. Yes, he says, souls differ in their capacity to receive and manifest the light of the Spirit. The Blessed Perfection said, and I think Baha'u'llah here was quoting a hadith, there are as many ways to God as the breaths of his human creatures. Each soul must develop according to individual capacity. So at the outset, we want to be sure to make it clear that there is no programmatic path of ascent in the Baha'i Writings. There is no dogmatic finality to anything really, but especially to this matter of spiritual advancement. And so what I'll be presenting are just a few different frameworks, one might say, through which this process of the returning arc has been described. So the first one, perhaps the simplest one, is that it's essentially a transition from a state of unbelief to a state of belief. That we are born in a state of potentiality, like caterpillars. Our destiny, our spiritual potentiality is fulfilled when we break out of the chrysalis and become butterflies. And there are so many different ways in which this spiritual transformation is described in different religious texts. One of them is, as we'll see, the imagery of being born again, the imagery of baptism, various images that emphasize almost the instantaneous quality of it. You are in a certain state and then suddenly a switch is flipped on, the lights flood the mind and the soul, and now you're at a different plane of awareness. Baha'u'llah seems to suggest this in many different places. Once in the Kitab-i-Iqan, he says, "O my brother, take thou the step of the Spirit, so that swift as the twinkling of an eye thou mayest flash through the wilds of remoteness and bereavement, attain the Rezvan of everlasting reunion, and in one breath commune with the heavenly spirits. For with human feet thou canst never hope to traverse these immeasurable distances, nor attain thy goal." And this almost instantaneous process of transformation, of taking that step of the Spirit and being changed utterly, as I mentioned, is often discussed using this metaphor of baptism or second birth. And I'm just going to give one example here, and one of the units in the seminars will be looking at a number of other examples. And I find it a little bit of a curious thing that it's not brought to the foreground more in Baha'i culture, this idea of second birth, this idea of baptism, because it's pervasive throughout the Baha'i writings, particularly Abdu'l-Baha. I suppose one could argue Abdu'l-Baha was adapting, and usually he's speaking to Westerners when he talks in these images, and so one could say he's simply adapting his speech to the cultural context of those to whom he was speaking. But in one place he says, "Divine nearness is made possible through the baptism of water and fire revealed in the Gospels. Water symbolizes the water of life, which is knowledge, and fire is the fire of the love of God. Therefore, man must be baptized with the water of life, the Holy Spirit, and the fire of the love of the kingdom. Until he attains these 3 degrees, nearness to God is not possible." So, again, you'll be reading more and discussing this sort of mode of thinking about spiritual advancement and the mystic path in about an hour. Another mode of thinking about spiritual awareness is not so much taking that single step into this other realm, but the gradual expansion of our consciousness, the gradual expansion of the circle of our regard, which begins very naturally centered on ourselves. And then as we become more spiritually aware and mature, that boundary of regard extends. One way to say what the main message of the Baha'i faith is that it extends this circle of regard past one's neighbor, past one's kin, past one's own even conception of religious community, out to encompass all of humanity equally, the entire planet. Abdu'l-Baha says in this regard, every imperfect soul is self-centered and thinketh only of his own good. But as his thoughts expand a little, he will begin to think of the welfare and comfort of his family. If his ideas still more widen, his concern will be the felicity of his fellow citizens. And if still they widen, he will be thinking of the glory of his land and of his race. But when ideas and views reach the utmost degree of expansion and attain the stage of perfection, then will he be interested in the exaltation of humankind. He will then be the well-wisher of all men and the seeker of the weal and prosperity of all lands. This is indicative of perfection. So we can say this is the second way of thinking about the spiritual path, that your horizons expand to include the universe. And I would include in this not just once the circle of one's regard hits the border of the planet. It's not just the people on the planet that one is concerned about, but it's the environment in which we live that sustains us all. So this would also include an appreciation for the delicacy of the ecosystem in which we live and our responsibility to preserve that for future generations. And in that way, the circle of our regard is not just including everyone here on the planet at this moment in time, but everyone in the future. So thinking about our environmental responsibility is also a way of thinking about it's extending our circle of regard to future generations. Now, a third way, and this may be the one that is most prominent in the Baha'i writings, because Baha'u'llah's preeminent mystical work, we know, is the Seven Valleys. And there are a lot of different ways of reading the Seven Valleys, and I will be suggesting one possible way of reading the Seven Valleys that sees each valley in terms of how one encounters tensions and opposites. And this way of thinking about the spiritual path, the mystic path, was actually inspired by one of the later mystical tablets of Baha'u'llah, which appear in this new volume, The Call of the Divine Beloved. It talks about things in relationship to how do you view the beloved? Is the beloved something outside of you? Is the beloved something that is the same as you? Are you in opposition to it? Are you unified with it? And one way to think about the spiritual journey then is this gradual, step-by-step process, perhaps beginning with ignorance and heedlessness of there even being a journey to embark upon. But then once one embarks upon that journey and enters into that first valley, there's the recognition of, let's say, opposites, the recognition of tensions, of dichotomies, of the existence of a beloved that you might be striving to attain. But before I dive into these seven valleys, I just want to say one extra thing, because I really want to emphasize the non-dogmatic nature of all of this. And even Baha'u'llah, later on in his ministry in Akka, when someone asks him about the seven valleys, even Baha'u'llah says something very surprising about it, to kind of take away any idea on our part that this forms some sort of catechism or some sort of dogmatic finality in thinking of these things. So Baha'u'llah says, and this is many years later, he says this treatise, The Seven Valleys, was revealed in the language of the people in the days prior to our declaration. The occasion for its revelation was the receipt of a letter addressed to the Most Holy Court in Iraq from a man of Sunni persuasion who was both a scholar and a mystic. This treatise was therefore revealed in accordance with divine wisdom in the manner that was current among the people. However, in this day, every soul who hath fixed his gaze upon the supreme horizon and hath recognized the one true God hath verily attained unto every one of the 7 valleys or 7 stations mentioned therein. For in this dispensation every idle fancy hath been cleft asunder, and all have been instructed once they have recognized God to acquire such knowledge as can profit humanity and to forsake the pursuit of imaginary attainments. So I guess we ought to start with this word of warning, not to get too tied up in, well, what valley am I in? You know, what valley are you in? All of this. So we can think of this framework of valleys as a useful way of navigating our spiritual destinies without thinking of it too much as a kind of grade school thing. You know, I'm in this valley now, you're in that valley. So going back to this first valley, you can think of this first valley as a valley where one first recognizes this tension of opposites. And in pulling these together, these slides have way too much on them, and so I'm not even going to read everything, but the contents of them will be shared later if you're interested in looking. What I did was I pulled together passages from the 7 valleys, the 4 valleys, Gems of Divine Mysteries, which also has its own miniature version of the 7 valleys kind of embedded within it, as well as these other more newly translated mystical tablets from the Call of the Divine Beloved, and sort of mashed them together, because oftentimes they'll talk about a particular valley from a slightly different perspective in ways that's very helpful. For example, when it comes to the Valley of Search, there seems to be consensus among Baha'u'llah's various tablets regarding this, that the primary prerequisite of this valley is purity of heart. We see this in the opening paragraph of the famous passage in the Kitab-i-Iqan about the prerequisites of the true seeker. We find it in the opening of the 7 valleys as well, that it's incumbent upon these servants to cleanse the heart, which is the wellspring of divine treasures of every marking. In Gems of Divine Mysteries, it also says he must sanctify his soul from the veils of glory. And also in the 7 valleys, it emphasizes patience as being one of the great virtues of this valley. And I'll also mention as a side point that it's interesting to me that when one looks at what's going on in each valley, it's not primarily about what are the virtues that we're cultivating in each valley. It's more, that seems to be more of a background behind what's going on. As one's traversing the valley, one's consciousness is expanding, one's virtue is increasing. But what Baha'u'llah describes in the 7 valleys is more how one sees the world becomes transformed from valley to valley. I mention this because we're quickly mentioning things like purity of heart and patience. What about all the virtues in relation to the spiritual, in relation to these stages in the spiritual search? These, I think, form, as far as this conversation is concerned, form more of the background. But when I mentioned that this valley of search is the valley in which one first discovers the existence of the beloved, in a way, first comes into awareness of this tension of opposites, let's say. This is mentioned most clearly in Gems of Divine Mysteries in relation to this valley, where it says, in this journey, the garden of search, the seeker becometh witness to a myriad changes and transformations, confluences and divergences. Having become aware of this recognition of opposites, one is plunged into the valley of love, in which one experiences the tension of opposites most acutely. And by tension of opposites, I mean the fact that the beloved is out there and I'm not with the beloved. This yearning for God, which is as yet unfulfilled. There's love there, there's the desire to attain, but the beloved is still far away. And in this valley, Baha'u'llah describes the pain that one feels, the loss of reason one gets out of one's mind. And in this famous story of the watchman, that if we've read the 7 Valleys, we probably remember that story. It's one of one of the most difficult things to puzzle out. What's this referring to? Baha'u'llah says that the lover in this valley, as the lover is pursued by the watchman, his heart, broken by absence of the beloved, a watchman appears, pursues the lover throughout the city streets. The lover comes to a wall and scales the wall, and on the other side of the wall finds the beloved. And Baha'u'llah says this watchman was outwardly a source of great vexation to the lover, of great threat perhaps, but at the end of the journey, having scaled the wall and found the beloved, one realizes that the watchman performed a certain function. The watchman was actually that entity that enabled the lover to come into the presence of the beloved. But in the Valley of Love, one bewails this whole situation. In the Seven Valleys, Baha'u'llah says, if the lover could have seen the end, he would from the beginning have blessed the watchman. But since the end was veiled to him, he lamented and made his plaint in the beginning. Such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley. So then we proceed to the third valley, having experienced the full pain of this separation from the beloved. One finally attains to the beloved in a certain way. This is the valley of knowledge, the reconciliation of opposites. I believe this is the stage that Baha'u'llah describes in such beautiful words in the Kitab-i-Igan, where he gives the prerequisites of search, and then he describes what happens when the seeker enters into the city of certitude, the city of ma'rifat, the city of mystical knowledge. And Baha'u'llah says it, for example, in the Igan, only when the lamp of search, of earnest striving, of longing desire, of passionate devotion, of fervent love, of rapture and ecstasy. Is that a beautiful way of describing the first two valleys? Is kindled within the seeker's heart, and the breeze of his loving kindness is wafted upon his soul, will the darkness of error be dispelled, the mists of doubts and misgivings be dissipated, and the lights of knowledge and certainty envelop his being. And in the Seven Valleys, describing, I think, this same process, he says, and if confirmed by the Creator, the lover escapeth the claws of the eagle of love. He will enter the realm of knowledge and come out of doubt into certitude, entering from the darkness of wayward desire to the guiding light of the fear of God. And in relation to this whole business of attention of opposites, this is where one understands is able to reconcile the two opposites, is able to, he describes it here, such as the state of the wayfarers in this valley. He's talking about the valley of love. But the people of the valleys above this, the valley of knowledge, see the end and the beginning as one. So here you are at the valley of knowledge, and prior to that, it's the tension of opposites. It's the watchman pursuing you. After this, you understand, in the end, the lover and the beloved were one. But at this state itself, one is come to a reconciliation of opposites without yet reaching the state of understanding that the lover and the beloved are one. So it's kind of a transition between those two. That state of understanding that the lover and the beloved are one is actually the next valley, which is the valley of unity. And it's interesting here that Baha'u'llah describes in an even higher elevation these valleys. He describes the first three valleys as the valleys of distinction or limitation. And then the next four valleys are valleys of unity. So you can think of it as seven valleys, or you can think of it as basically two main processes. The process of seeing the world fundamentally from a dualistic perspective, this and that. The world broken into parts. Every part is distinct from every other part. Of course, the beloved being something that outside of us. God being a being that we might prove the existence of out in the universe or outside the universe somewhere, but still a being, not us. And the next four valleys are valleys of unity, in which one comes gradually closer to the realization that separateness is an illusion. That it's first of all the unity of opposites, as we see in this valley of unity, and then stages beyond that. So first of all, the unity of opposites is valley number 4. Baha'u'llah calls this the first stage in the first stage of unity. And thank you. And Baha'u'llah describes it like this in the Seven Valleys. He says, such is the state, and repeating what I read before, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley, valley of love, but the people of the valleys above this, above the valley of knowledge, see the end and the beginning as one. Nay, they, the residents of the valley of unity, see neither beginning nor end, and witness neither first nor last. So the opposites are not just reconciled, but they're seen as end and the beginning are actually one. Elsewhere, Baha'u'llah says, after passing through the valley of knowledge, which is the last station of limitation, the wayfarer cometh to the first station of unity, and drinketh from the cup of oneness, and gazeth upon the manifestations of singleness. In this station he pierceth the veils of plurality, fleeth the realms of the flesh, and ascendeth unto the heaven of unity. But this valley of unity is only the first of 4 valleys, which together comprise these the second half of the 7 valleys. First one, having achieved this great realization that the end and the beginning are one. One is into the valley of contentment. And Baha'u'llah says that at this stage, once the end and the beginning are one, you really lose your ability, because everything is no longer formally distinguished from everything else, because it's all become one. Baha'u'llah says, look, you can't really describe these valleys with words anymore, but he's going to do it anyway. But he warns you at the beginning, can't really describe it, but here's what's happening. He says, the tongue faileth in describing these three valleys, and speech falleth short. The pen steppeth not into the serene, the ink leaveth only a blot. In these stations the nightingale of the heart hath other songs and secrets which make the heart to leap, and the soul to cry out. But this mystery of inner meaning may be whispered only from heart to heart, and confided only from breast to breast. So the first of these 3 valleys is the valley of contentment. It's almost as though the wayfarer, having made this great realization that everything is one, is kind of not patting himself on the back, but is very, very happy and pleased to be there. Everything is hunky-dory. But then, in the Valley of Wonderment, which is the next valley, this is almost like the wayfarer is very happy to have achieved this state of understanding. But then something dawns. Oh no, what I thought was myself is going to end up getting annihilated. What I thought was reality, the ground beneath my feet, as a consequence of understanding that all things are one, has been pulled out. And this leads to what has been translated as wonderment, hayrat, but could also be translated as confusion or bewilderment. And it's not all positive, it's not all described in positive terms. You might think at this very late stage of the mystical journey, you ought to be pretty happy. You ought to having attained these great insights. But in this stage, preceding the stage of fana, the stage of true poverty and absolute nothingness, there's this intimation, I think, of realizing that you're standing on the edge of an abyss, and that you're going to have to step into that abyss, and that abyss is the 7th valley. So in this valley of wonderment, then, Baha'u'llah says that many fail, perish ere they attain their final abode in gems and divine mysteries. The wayfarers stray and perish ere they attain their final abode. Bewilderment will seize them from every side. In the 7 valleys, he said, how many a mystic tree hath this whirlwind of bewilderment snatched by the roots? How many a soul hath it worn out and exhausted? So I think this is the edge of the abyss. And then, when you dive into the abyss, this is the stage of fana. This is the final valley of the 7 valleys. The valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness, where one proceeds from It's a stage of the unity of opposites, having gone through these stages of recognizing them, being hurt by them, recognizing that, oh, they're actually reconciled with each other, and then, oh, that they're actually one. And the stage of Fanon, the stage of true poverty and absolute nothingness, it's the annihilation of opposites. It's a complete sort of erasing of the board in a way. Baha'u'llah describes this as that of dying to the self and living in God, of being poor in the self and rich in the desired one. He say, all that he hath from marrow to skin will be set aflame, so that nothing will remain save the friend. It's a complete destruction of the ego. It's an erasure of the ego boundaries. It is the moth having circled the flame, now finally dives into the flame and its wings catch fire, and to all outward seeming the moth has been completely destroyed by the flame. And in the imagery, in the Sufi imagery. But only after the moth dives into the flame and burns its wings and disappears can it be said to have actually attained the flame. The prerequisite of that attainment is the death of self. Baha'u'llah in Gems of Divine Mysteries, it's such a great parallel to the Seven Valleys. I do recommend reading, if you're interested in getting into these mystical topics, to really have Gems of Divine Mysteries almost open next to the Seven Valleys, because they speak to each other so intimately. Baha'u'llah describes this journey of utter self-effacement, in which the wayfarer forgetteth his soul, spirit, body, and very being, immerses himself in the sea of nothingness, and liveth on earth as one unworthy of mention. Nor will one find any sign of his existence, for he hath vanished from the realm of the visible, and attained unto the heights of self-abnegation. How can a true lover continue to exist when once the effulgent glories of the beloved are revealed? How can the shadow endure when once the sun hath shone forth? It sounds a little bit like what Baha'u'llah said, of course, many years later in one of his tablets: release yourselves from this world's life, and at every stage long ye for non-existence. For when the ray returneth to the sun, it is wiped out. And here he uses that word, Fatima. And when the drop cometh to the sea, it vanisheth. And when the true lover findeth his beloved, he yieldeth up his soul. The drop, the analogy of the drop reuniting with the sea, is also described in terms of, and I think this was in one of the quotation packets from the other day. Everything is, in Baha'i cosmology, let us say, it's a three-tiered ringstone symbol. We've all seen the ringstone symbol, which represents the realm of the divine essence, the realm of command, and the realm of creation. And it's the realm of creation that's kind of broken into these arcs of ascent and descent. But the arcs of ascent and descent, the whole realm of creation, can be thought of as waves on the sea of the will. And the will, the primal will, is that middle tier of the ringstone symbol. It is the Word in the Gospel of John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. There's this primordial sea, the waters upon which the Spirit breathed in the first verses of Genesis. This is a very ancient idea of water somehow being the beginning of things, the ocean of the primal will. And in Baha'i cosmology, it's a weird phrase because that phrase isn't found anywhere in the Baha'i writings. This top tier of the ringstone, so the essence of God, remains separate from it all, completely transcendent. In fact, the Bab says that the primal will generates itself. So there's a self-creation of the primal will, which is the circle of existence, which is I desired to be loved, therefore I brought creation into being that I might be loved. That's all at the level of the primal will. There's still this higher level beyond that, the level of the divine essence, which has no causal linkage to the rest of it. So you might ask, well, what's the point of it then? It's not causing anything. It's not doing anything. You can just kind of erase it and you end up with the same picture of the world, that, you know, the divinity of the world, but and everything is drops and waves of the sea. Isn't that nice enough? You know, why do we need to have this extra tier on the top? And I can't tell you the answer, but someone gave a great answer yesterday, I think yesterday or the day before. It's to keep us humble. If we think we understand it all, if we think that we are God because God is the waves and I is the ocean, I'm the waves of the ocean, then hey, I'm God. So maybe just keeping that extra tier up there is just to keep us humble. Maybe there's a better answer than that. So here's what Abdu'l-Baha says about our status in relation to the sea. He says, your souls are as waves on the sea of the Spirit. Although each individual is a distinct wave, the ocean is one, and all are united in God. Every heart should radiate unity, so that the light of the one divine source of all may shine forth bright and luminous. We must not consider the separate waves alone, but the entire sea. We should rise from the individual to the whole. The Spirit is as one great ocean, and the waves thereof are the souls of men. And here he's actually paraphrasing Baha'u'llah, saying basically the same thing. So, you might think it ends with the seventh valley of annihilation, but if it ends with annihilation, it kind of ends on a bit of a down note, right? The moth is gone, and that's the end of the story. In Gems of Divine Mysteries, Baha'u'llah adds a couple of extra valleys after the valley of annihilation, after the valley of true poverty and absolute nothingness. So after fana, after annihilation, the Sufis always knew that fana and baqa are paired with each other. Annihilation and immortality are paired with each other. And that only after one empties the self, only after one becomes ephemeral and dies to oneself, can one live in God. And that return, the next stage, the recovery of immortality, that eternal life on the other side of the death of self is the life in God. And this is, I think, part of the maybe dangerous thing that the Sufis say, because that life in God, the thing that you get at the other end of fana, it's not the same self that you had before. If you think, well, at the end of the journey, I'm back to where I was, you know, it's like the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell. You know, you go through the circle and you're back to the village you left from, and you have these great insights, but you're the same person as you were before. You just have extra insights. That's not the picture that Baha'u'llah gives of the spiritual journey towards annihilation, and then on the other side, immortality. Baha'u'llah says in Seven Valleys, such is the state of the wayfarers in this valley. This is the valley of love. He says, but the people of the valleys above this, and I'm reading this a third time because it's such a key passage, see the end and the beginning as one. Nay, they, residents of the valley of unity, see neither beginning nor end, and witness neither first nor last. This is the unity of opposites. And then in the next sentence, he takes us to the next stage. He says, nay, rather the denizens of the city of immortality, this is Baghal now, this is actually the stage after the seventh valley, who dwell in the celestial garden, see not even neither first nor last. They fly from all that is first, and repulse all that is last. For these have passed over the world of names, and swift as lightning, fled beyond the world of attributes. Thus it is said, the perfection of belief in divine unity is to deny him any attributes. So the final stage is letting go of the whole framework. All the names and attributes, the whole sort of mental, conceptual structures that we use to maybe as a ladder to help us get there. Once we get there, we can throw away the ladder because we realize it was just a way to assist us to get to this final realization, which is beyond names and attributes. And this is how Baha'u'llah puts it in one of his tablets. Taking the same notion of spiritual journey and now showing it as having 3 steps instead of 7. But these correlate nicely to the 7 valleys. He says, know thou that between us and the creatures there standeth a ladder with 3 steps. The first is described as the world and its vanities. The second as the hereafter and all that is ordained therein. And the third as the kingdom of names. Whoso is enabled to traverse these stations shall attain the presence of the Lord of names and attributes in less than a moment. Take heed, O people of Baha', lest ye tarry at these stations. Pass over them as swift as a passing cloud. This is really amazing to me because, even the idea of the afterlife, our concept of the hereafter, that's just the second step in the ladder. And we have to transcend that as well. We have to reach a point where we're not even thinking about this world versus the next world. And when we transcend when we rise up above the third step, we're not even in the realm of names and attributes anymore. Our old ways of thinking about, well, I believe or I don't believe, that whole conceptual framework of belief and unbelief, we see that itself as being a limiting framework in relation to what is beyond. And Baha'u'llah makes this explicitly clear in the tablet to the lion-hearted soul, a very short tablet that is, again, in this new compilation, The Call of the Divine Beloved. I recommend taking a lot of time with this tablet to the lion-hearted soul. Baha'u'llah almost takes the spiritual journey and kind of turns it inside out in a way that he describes the stages not in positive terms, but in negative terms. He describes the stages in terms of all of the impediments that you transcend as you go up, as you go along the valleys. So, and he describes 4 different impediments that all of which one has to get behind. And we'll see that this nicely underlines what he said earlier about the ladder with the 3 steps and what's in the 7 valleys. So the first impediment, he says, in all these stages, the mirror of the wayfarer's heart may bear the reflection of shadowy desires. And these stages here are the stages of limitation, the early stages. May bear the reflection of shadowy desires, wayward thoughts, and worldly attachments. So that's still something there in the early stages of the mystic journey. Then, after another paragraph, he says, these tidings, however, are not constant and immutable in these stations, the valleys of limitation, and the wayfarer remaineth confined between the right hand of faith and assurance and the left hand of denial and despair. So that whole idea of, do I believe or not, becomes a limiting framework. One has to pass beyond belief and unbelief. To another point, this is now the stage of unity. We're in the second half of the 7 valleys. He says, this station, the station of unity, hath its own obscurities and impediments, for they that journey towards the land of divine unity and detachment are still wrapped within the confines of names and attributes. See, they see the end and the beginning as one, but they haven't yet transcended ends and beginnings, and take delight in their gardens and bowers. And then a little bit farther along, now we're getting to the later stages of divine, of unity. He says, howbeit some are led astray even in this station, for no sooner do they inhale the fragrance of reunion and hearken unto the voice of the doves of heavenly grace than they imagine themselves to have attained perfection and wander in the wilderness of self-conceit. And the same warning Baha'u'llah drops at the end of Gems of Divine Mysteries, where after describing the journey through all of the valleys and cities, Baha'u'llah says, if having attained all of these stations, there should enter into the seeker's heart the least trace of pride and vainglory, he will be at that very moment returned to the first stage of the journey without realizing it. So impediments remain at each stage of the spiritual path, and this wonderful tablet gives us that kind of very alternative view of what's going on along the stages. Overall, what we see in the distinction between the early stages and the later stages in the mystical path, as I was outlining in that skeleton key, is that our initial intuition, about the world, which is that it's divided up into things, which is a very reasonable intuition, and which gets us very far, and which is very accurate to a point, that intuition has to be left behind in the later stages. One has to embrace the very counterintuitive notion that the differences that we see are illusory. Differences between us and God, perhaps finally, and most dangerously, because this is where the mystics can get lost in the wilderness of self-conceit. But also the differences between us and other souls. That there's ultimately, behind all of this lies a vision of oneness, which we can think of in terms of the circle of existence as that's what happens at the tail end of the arc of ascent, when the one, having become many in the stages of descent, now is finally become one again. And so that oneness of vision that we're talking about, these valleys of unity in the second half of the seven valleys, can be thought of as that's the end point of the arc of ascent. That's the reunion with the Creator. So how does Baha'u'llah talk about, in some non-dualistic terms, about the unity of the that and the this, the unity of the I and the thou, in terms of the divine? In Gleanings, and I don't know if it's an accident that Shoghi Effendi, who assembled and translated the Gleanings, put this as the very first selection of Gleanings. Baha'u'llah says the following, which to me kind of subverts our whole framework of thinking about God dualistically. He says, Baha'u'llah says, whatever duty thou hast prescribed unto thy servants, of extolling to the utmost thy majesty and glory, is but a token of thy grace unto them, that they may be enabled to ascend unto the station conferred upon their own inmost being, the station of the knowledge of their own selves. The whole point of worshiping God is coming to a closure of the circle of existence, realizing that the divine spark was within all the time. Turn thy sight unto thyself, that thou mayest find me standing within thee. And when one recognizes that, one realizes that all the worship of God out there, which has its place, has like a ladder that gets you somewhere, has as its final stage the recognition of the divine light within. And that's what completes the circle of existence. This idea of non-duality reaches, in a practical way, to our notion of prayer. Tens of thousands of prayers in the Baha'i writings. And almost all of them describe it in petitionary terms. God, the great, is being asked for something. The one praying is petitioning God for grace or for something else. This idea, though, embeds a notion of duality, embeds a separateness between the worshiper and the one worshipped, which is correct and true as far as the first three values go, as far as the values of distinction go, but once you get into the values of unity, that's no longer the correct way to understand the relationship. And the Bab says it in the following way. He says, he who worshipeth God through anyone but him, by gazing at his own self as the worshipper, and at God as the object of his worship, hath joined partners with God, and hath never worshipped him. What he's describing is just what everyone does. Gazing at oneself as the worshiper and God as the object of worship. But he warns us, this is a form of idolatry at some stage, not at every stage. Again, we're describing a truth which is relative to a certain stage of the spiritual journey, not a truth that is relative to. And it's only, I think, a deep realization in its own context. Out of its context, it's gobbledygook. Out of its own context, it probably makes no sense at all. But hopefully, I've established enough of the logic of the process to see what the place of these sorts of statements is, and it's at the sort of far end of the valleys. And this, I think, is for me the bit that really locks in the relationship between the final valleys as representing a transition to a non-dualistic picture, and the circle of existence, the relationship between those two. And it's a difficult passage, but it's I think quite important and worth reading and thinking about. And it's in the context of the Bab here saying that that God wants to remember himself to his creatures. And the Bab often uses the phrase remembrance. So God wants to remember himself to the creatures. And so this divine self-remembrance is one way of looking at the circle of existence. It's one way of looking at the arcs of ascent and descent. It's the journeys of love, as Baha'u'llah describes it in Paris Talks. The love from the creatures to the true one, and the true one to the creatures, and finally, from the true one to the true one. So that fourth kind of love, that love of the invisible for its own essence, through a ray of which all other love comes into being. This is what the station that the Bab is describing. And listen to what he does almost offhand, halfway through it. He blows up our whole conception of who we are. He says, therefore it is necessary, according to true wisdom, that the pre-existent God describe himself to his creatures, that they may recognize their creator, and that out of the grace of the pre-existent, the contingent beings may attain their supreme end. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. It's the primal will. The primal will is, but it creates itself. This divine self-description is itself a created thing. Whoso hath recognized it, hath recognized his Lord. This description is denoted as the soul or self. And he who hath known himself hath known his Lord. Behold with the eye of thy heart, verily thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is. So, this is worth reading a number of times. Particularly in the middle of this, he slips this in. This description is denoted as the soul or self. We thought the soul or self was something other than this, perhaps. Our own piece of immortality, our own chunk and our own atomized bit of spiritual reality that we can count on being ours. But the way the Bab describes the soul or self, it's a mode of the divine self-remembrance. It's part of, it's a ray of this divine sun that's emanating at all times, and at all times the emanations are returning through the arc of ascent, which can kind of change our way of looking at things. It can change our way of looking at who we are and what's really important and what's not important. So I found in prayers and meditations, I thought I heard Baha'u'llah say something very similar to this, because this is a very challenging statement. You would like for Baha'u'llah to have backed it up somewhere in his tablets. And I thought I heard this in prayers and meditations number 78. And I'll read just part of this. Baha'u'llah says, every time I'm reminded of thee and muse on thy virtues, I am seized with such ecstasies and am so enravished by thee that I find myself unable to make a mention of thy name and to extol thee. I am carried back to such heights that I recognize myself to be the same as the remembrance of thee in thy realm, and the essence of thy praise among thy servants. As long as that self endureth, so long will thy praise continue to be shed abroad among thy creatures, and thy remembrance glorified by thy people. Every man endued with insight among thy servants is persuaded that myself liveth eternally and can never perish, inasmuch as remembrance of thee is eternal, and will endure so long as thine own self endureth. And thy praise is everlasting, and will last as long as thine own sovereignty will last. So Baha'u'llah is relating our own immortality. The fact that we last is related to God's own remembrance. It sounds similar to me to what the Bab was saying in that tablet. I leave it to you ultimately, because this is one of those sort of heavy, weighty statements that you want to make sure you're interpreting this right. Because these have practical consequences. These highly mystical, theoretical ideas can practically change the way we relate to others in the world. And I want to emphasize that point now, but it's really going to be in the next session that we talk about what this means for our behavior collectively. What do these kinds of mystical insights of the oneness of everything, of the relative truth of all these stations within their own unique position, it can give us, I think, keys to resolving otherwise unresolvable chasms between different ways of being and thinking. And I think David Starr Jordan recognized this in, he was the first president of Stanford University, and he said that Abdu'l-Baha, when Abdu'l-Baha visited in 1912, that Abdu'l-Baha will surely unite the East and the West, where he walks the mystical path with practical feet. And these practical feet that Abdu'l-Baha walks with are a way of translating what otherwise would be a very personal, even self-centered kind of journey. Go on a mountaintop and do this on your own. But that's not how it's supposed to be done. These journeys that lead to annihilation and rebirth and immortality, these journeys of transformation are meaningful only to the extent that they happen in relation to others, because it's through others that our own spiritual destinies are fulfilled. And just to give you a glimpse of where one of the places this can be going tomorrow, Baha'u'llah says this at the end of one of these newly translated mystical tablets about spiritual understandings. And one can imagine here that he's referring to people in the early valleys versus people in the later valleys. They're all on a genuine, good faith, spiritual journey. But the people in the early valleys see the world through completely different eyes than those in the later valleys. Those in the earlier valleys are basically seeing through the eye of distinction, and those in the later valleys are seeing through the eye of unity. But Baha'u'llah wants to assure us that all of these are true and correct within their own station. So we can never put ourselves in the position of affirming one of these perspectives while denying the others. So Baha'u'llah says this in this tablet. He says, since all do not possess the same degree of spiritual understanding, certain statements will inevitably be made, and there shall arise, as a consequence, as many differing opinions as there are human minds, and as many divergent beliefs as there are created things. This is certain and settled, and can in no wise be averted. Our aim is that thou shouldst urge all the believers to show forth kindness and mercy, and to overlook certain shortcomings among them, that differences may be dispelled, true harmony be established, and the censure and reproach, the hatred and dissension seen among the peoples of former times may not arise anew. So all of this mystical talk ultimately ends in the world, and it ends with this prescription of the divine physician, and the diagnosis of the illness of disunity, and the prescription, and even the mystical prescription, which you might think is a very personal, private thing that you do off on your own, actually becomes something which is an integral part of the remedy, an integral part of the coming together and the uniting of the human race. And as Baha'u'llah puts it here, this uniting of the human race is going to be in the face of all kinds of diversity. Diversity we may not be prepared to deal with right now. We're used to thinking maybe a little bit monochromatically. We like to talk about diversity a lot, but when it comes to the true diversity of very different opinions, we might be a little bit too eager to think, at least in our own hearts, that we're right and the other person is wrong. And I think it is considerations such as this that help break us out of those confining worldviews and to be able to truly see and appreciate the full diversity of the human experience.